It's so nice to see you all here today. My name is Stephanie Robert, and it's my privilege to be the director of the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work. Oh, I like that. That doesn't happen to me at home. So I'd like to start our festivities today by having us all take a moment to acknowledge and reflect upon the fact that the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Teejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. So I'm thankful that so many of our alumni, faculty, students, and guests are here tonight to hear Dr. Anna Gassman-Pines' important and timely talk. It's very special that Dr. Gassman-Pines will give her talk at this event, where we are honoring her mother, the amazing Roberta Gassman. Roberta is one of our own. She's an alumna of the school, a longtime instructor on public policy and macro practice, an Emerita Board of Visitors member, an honorary fellow and mentor to many in the school. Indeed, Robin Matthews, an alumna from our school, says, "There are many professors I remember fondly at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work, but Roberta was a standout. Her class was inspiring, motivated me to change course on my professional career, and offered so much content that I still apply in my professional career today." Robin says, "I admire Roberta and remember thinking, I hope I do half the good in my career that Roberta has done in hers. She's a role model and continues to inspire me to advocate for myself personally and professionally and to never give up on big opportunities." This year marks Roberta's 50th anniversary of graduating with an MSSW from our school. Among her many awards, which are too many for me to list right now, included her 2010 Distinguished Alumni Award from our school, which included the establishment of the Roberta Gassman School of Social Work Opportunities Fund and Distinguished Lecture Series, which you are benefiting from tonight. Simply put, we are here today to honor Roberta Gassman's generosity and commitment to our school and to our community. Just yesterday, the Cap Times published a beautiful piece on their editorial page honoring Roberta. Did people see it? Yeah. Yes, I've got a copy right here if you want to read it. I encourage you to read it, but let me share just a little bit about Roberta's accomplishments. Roberta Gassman has had a long career in public service and leadership at the federal, state, and local levels. She served in President Obama's administration in Washington, D.C. as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Employment and Training at the U.S. Department of Labor. She was Wisconsin's longest-serving labor secretary at the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development in Governor Jim Doyle's cabinet, and I know Governor Doyle is here tonight. Roberta served as Governor Tony Earle's policy advisor on employment and women's issues, and she was a top aide to Madison Mayor Paul Soglin and Director of Communications for the Dane County Executive. After many decades of public service, Roberta continues to be an active community volunteer. For example, she just finished serving her 2-year term as the chair of the Board of Governors at the Madison Community Foundation. She continues to serve on that board as a member of its executive committee. Bob Sorge, president and CEO of the Madison Community Foundation, says, "What I can tell you about Roberta is that she embraces every role with vigor. She digs deep into materials and is always well prepared for meetings." She sees not only the immediate needs and opportunities, but always has an eye on the horizon, assessing current activities for long-term outcomes. Bob continues, "Roberta's tenure as a Madison Community Foundation board member, and particularly as board chair, has exemplified the philosophy of leadership by example. And MCF is stronger in many ways because of that leadership." Roberta also just completed her long-term service on the board of United Way, Dane County. She previously served as president of the Madison Equal Opportunities Commission and on the boards of Edgewood College, Overture Center Foundation, Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, Madison Repertory Theater, Downtown Madison, Inc., Wisconsin Technical College System, and the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. She's an active member of Downtown Rotary and Tempo. Betty Custer, who has known Roberta for 30 years, including working with her as co-chair of development for the Overture Center, says, "Roberta is tireless in her efforts to serve others. She is well connected and not afraid to approach both friends and strangers to support efforts that she thinks will serve the greater good." Her several years as chair of the board of the Madison Community Foundation are a testament to the goodwill she has fostered in all areas of the community. These are just a few of her many diverse efforts. Madison is a better place for having Roberta as one of its committed citizens, says Betty. In sum, beyond everything that Roberta has directly done for the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work, she has served as a role model for our students and for so many of us. She demonstrates how a strong social worker can lead and make a difference in so many capacities. For those of you who didn't already know of Roberta's many contributions, you now only have a small glimpse into her energy and commitment. She makes our school, our community, and our world a better place, and I'm glad you can be here to honor her tonight. And if you are so inclined, you can further honor Roberta by contributing to the Roberta Gassman Opportunities Fund, which ensures that the school has funds to support our social justice efforts and our work to diversify our student body and our faculty and promote inclusion of our diverse community. And so there are little handouts around that have tiny URLs where you can link to contribute to Roberta's fund. To further honor Roberta, I would like to now introduce Frances Huntley Cooper, who has known and worked with Roberta for many years. Frances is also an esteemed alumna from our school, and we are grateful that she serves as a current member of our Board of Visitors. As many of you know, among her many accomplishments, Frances Huntley Cooper was the first African American elected as a mayor in Wisconsin when she became mayor of Fitchburg. And I don't know if you saw, but just last month, it was very exciting, the city of Fitchburg dedicated its Common Council chambers to Frances. Please, yes. So please welcome Frances Huntley Cooper.
I'm honored to be here to celebrate Roberta Gassman's 50th anniversary of graduating from the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work. and to hear about Dr. Anna Gassman's important research. Before I turn the floor over to Roberta to introduce her daughter, I am pleased to announce that Governor Tony Evers has issued commendations for both Roberta Gassman and Dr. Anna Gassman-Pines. I'm not going to read it, but the commendations note that there are many accomplishments, and end by saying, I, Tony Evers, Governor of the state of Wisconsin, do hereby commend Dr. Anna Gassman-Pines and Roberta Gassman for their countless contributions to the state of Wisconsin. On behalf of the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work Board of Visitors, congratulations to you both, and thank you, Roberta, for your tireless efforts to improve the lives of Wisconsin citizens. And now I'd like to invite Roberta Gassman to the podium to introduce Dr. Anna Gassman-Pines.
Well, this is pretty overwhelming. It's wonderful to see all of you. Thank you, Steph and Francis, for your kind words. I thank you all for being here. Some of you flew in from afar. Jeff and Angela Bartell flew in from Tucson for this. Ellen O'Brien Saunders, my longtime, first my boss, mentor, friend, flew in from Olympia, Washington. And Anna's rock star sister from Minneapolis flew in yesterday. So thank you to the school for hosting us all today. To my husband, Lester, who first encouraged me, this is true, to get my MSSW here. Here in Madison, where we met, working at Madison's First Settlement House, neighborhood house. And then that was followed by a very 60s courtship, rallies, demonstrations, getting tear gassed all together. The school has meant a lot to me. I had professors who opened up new ideas, new skills for me, and helped in my macro work toward the work of working on behalf of social justice and making lives better for the vulnerable. I am forever grateful. Now to Anna. Anna has always been a joy, a total joy. She had the good fortune at Yale to study under Professor Ed Ziegler, the star developmental psychologist who launched really the National Head Start program and who advised every single president from Richard Nixon through President Obama on how to improve outcomes for vulnerable children. Her next mentor, Professor Hiro Yoshikawa, then recruited her to NYU to his doctoral team that was tackling policies for reducing child poverty. This led to Duke, where Anna was hired in their School of Public Policy. She's continued her work, of which we are so proud, as a poverty scholar researching low-wage work and the effects of welfare and employment policies. Now a full professor at Duke, she's won over a dozen national research awards, and Duke has honored you, Anna, for your teaching and for your mentoring also. Anna, since the pandemic hit our shores, was able in a very nimble way to turn her research attention to the impacts of COVID on vulnerable families. She's been examining throughout the pandemic effects on low-wage parents, school disruptions, child behavior and performance, racial disparities, unpredictable work schedules, economic instability, food insecurity, access to worker supports, including childcare, unemployment insurance, and food share, which used to be known as food stamps. She's published over 35 journal articles. She's co-authored multiple chapters in multiple books. She's written numerous policy reports and has given many media and policy presentations. You've been featured, Anna, not that we have these cut out and framed, but she's been featured in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, on National Public Radio, and more. Her research has been supported by many grants that you ambitiously work to raise and fellowships, including from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the National Institutes of Health, and the National Science Foundation, and more. You teach at Duke, for your graduate and doctoral students, you teach U.S. poverty policy, statistics for policymakers, and quantitative evaluation research. You're active at Duke. You're active in your profession, serving in many leadership roles. Most importantly, you are the mom of our amazing Izzy and Theo, even recently serving as the president of their PTO in your spare time. In these challenging times, as many are still recovering from the impacts of the pandemic, we hunger for data. We hunger for policy solutions. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Anna Gassman-Pines to the podium.
Well, thank you all for being here. I am absolutely thrilled to be able to give this talk. It's not every day you get invited to give a distinguished lecture. It's really not every day that you get invited to give a distinguished lecture in your hometown. And it's really not every day that you get invited to give a distinguished lecture in your hometown that is honoring your own mother. And it is just amazing to see so many familiar faces in the audience. So I am going to take the speaker's prerogative to say just a few words about today's honoree. There she is during her social work days. And I want to thank my co-conspirator, my father, Lester Pines, for helping me obtain this photo. So I will be brief, but I will just say we've heard a lot about my mom, Roberta Gassman, already, but I can really say that I would not be where I am today without her. She is a true public servant, working throughout her career for equality and justice, especially for women and people in marginalized socioeconomic positions. And for the students out there, take note. This is a truly inspiring example of how social work training, the kind of social work training you can get here at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work, can translate into impact on our community, on our state, our country, and really the world. She did this work in the mayors, county executives, governors, and presidents' offices, while also being a caring, tenacious, and all-around fantastic parent to me and my sister. So she is also a stellar example of balancing work and family. Someone who has been deeply committed to me and my sister and a true partner to my father. I am deeply grateful to have her as a role model, mentor, and friend. And I love you very much, Mom. Okay, so we are going going to start the actual talk now. Okay. What I am going to be talking to you about today is the experiences of low-wage service workers with young children here in the United States. I'm going to cover three big topics. One is the challenges of balancing work and family that these workers faced prior to the pandemic. The second is to talk to you a bit about how the pandemic exacerbated these challenges. And the third is to talk about new policy approaches that we tried during the pandemic that illustrate in many ways what we can do better, but also shed light on ongoing inequalities that will need to be addressed moving forward. So these are the big topics. And I'm going to, in particular, talk to you about those three big topics by telling you a story about a study that I conducted that followed over 1,000 service workers with children between the ages of 2 and 7 in the city of Philadelphia. And we started this work before the pandemic, and it is continuing now. So backing up to before anyone even imagined there would be a pandemic, my colleague Elizabeth Ananat, an economist, and I both read at the same time this 2014 New York Times article that was actually written by Jodi Kantor, who went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for her work on the Me Too movement. And in this article, Jodi Kantor chronicled this mom, Jeanette Navarro, and her young son, Gavin. Jeanette was working at Starbucks at the time that this story was written, and she had no control over her work schedule. It was posted just a couple days before shifts. Sometimes she had to be on call. She didn't know if she'd go in or didn't go in. Sometimes if she was there and things were slow, she would get sent home. This made it very challenging for her to get her college degree, which she was desperately trying to do. And it also made it very hard for her to have stable care for her son. She had managed to get him into a very high quality, subsidized formal childcare slot, but because of the chaos with her schedule, she wasn't always able to drop him off or pick him up. She was constantly relying on family and friends to provide backup, and it was incredibly stressful. For her, it made it hard for her to get ahead, and it made it very difficult for her to balance her work and care responsibilities. Jeanette's experience is not unique. These types of service jobs are not anomalous. In fact, service has become the dominant sector of our economy. So here, the red line, which is going down, 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 is the share of workers in manufacturing. Those used to be very good jobs, especially for men, especially for white men, that have been disappearing in our country. And the blue line that's been going up, up, up is the share of workers in the service sector. So these are very common jobs. For less credentialed workers, these jobs are largely contingent hourly work. And much like Jeanette's experience, this work is characterized by high levels of unpredictability and instability in work schedules and therefore in take-home pay. If you don't work, you don't get paid. If you get sent home early, you don't get paid for the hours that were originally on the schedule that you don't get to work. Research in both child development and family studies suggests that these aspects of work pose risks for families and children. And these jobs in themselves contribute to ongoing racial inequality, as they are more likely to be held by racialized minorities for a variety of reasons. So this is the work context that we found ourselves in, thinking about as we started this project. This work context is juxtaposed with a particular policy context, where since 1996, we don't have in this country a guaranteed cash floor for families with children. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which replaced our old cash assistance program, provides cash for a limited time, and for able-bodied parents generally requires work. So in order to receive cash, people who are getting TANF need to be working. The Earned Income Tax Credit, and before 2021, the Child Tax Credit, are also work incentives. So they are tax policies that increase your income when you work. Then we have another set of benefits that are in-kind benefits, such as SNAP, what we used to call food stamps, Medicaid, that provides health insurance, and the Special Supplemental Program for Women, Infants, and Children, which is additional nutrition assistance for pregnant and nursing women and infants and young children. And then we have a host of other kinds of in-kind benefits, such as child care vouchers, housing vouchers, and public housing, that provide particular in-kind benefits but can be hard to get. And finally, in this policy context, is unemployment insurance, which is cash benefits. It's our main social insurance program that provides cash benefits to those who have lost employment through no fault of their own. So these things come together to provide a safety net that does indeed help families and children, but there are substantial gaps. There is strong evidence that the Earned Income Tax Credit, for example, reduces poverty and promotes child and family health and well-being, but it's not available to people who are not able to work. You only get the Earned Income Tax Credit if you work. If you have care responsibilities that keep you at home, you can't get that support. Or if you lose your job, you lose your benefit. And what this means is that rather than a safety net in a lot of ways, this benefit can create a job loss double whammy. So folks who lose a job not only lose the earnings that they're getting from that job, but also this additional tax benefit that serves as an earnings supplement. The in-kind programs reduce poverty and material hardship and improve child well-being and are an important part of the safety net, but you can't use them. You can't use a specific type of in-kind benefit to cover all the costs that families face when raising children. You can't use your food stamps to pay your rent or other bills or buy soap or clothes or diapers or the other necessities of life. They can lead to exclusion from the formal labor market, not from work, because the more you earn, the less you get from these benefits. And because they are primarily for the neediest among us, they can create bureaucracy and, in many cases, reflect institutional racism that keep people from getting supports stably and predictably. This is particularly true for workers of color. And finally, unemployment insurance reduces material hardship and promotes worker well-being, but many with unpredictable and unstable work schedules, such as Jeanette Navarro, don't qualify. It's not available to those who leave employment due to care responsibilities. And it also creates bureaucracy and reflects institutional racism that keeps people from accessing benefits. So, taken together, the safety net that we have is the strongest and most generous for those whose work is stable and predictable. But we know that service work itself is unstable and unpredictable. And so service work and service workers with young children are really where the conflict between the ideal worker, who is always available for work and doesn't get paid when it's not needed, and the laissez-faire approach of the US toward how families meet their own time and money needs in caring for their children reaches arguably its most unnavigable point. Activists, advocates, probably many of you in this room have been making this argument for years. I didn't make this up. Many have been making this point for many years. Prior to the pandemic, one way that momentum was building on this issue was a lot of labor organizing, in particular around laws and regulations and policy change that would regulate this aspect of schedule instability. And so before the pandemic, there were so-called schedule stability laws that were passed in a variety of cities and in one state in the United States that were aiming to solve this conundrum by putting policies in place that would make work schedules for service workers more stable and predictable. So this was the context in which my colleague and I found ourselves when we began this project, with an initial research focus to understand the experiences of families who are strongly attached to the labor force, folks who are working in the service sector, and how they navigate this service work and their care responsibilities within this broader work and policy context. We wanted to understand the unpredictability and instability in work schedules that these parents were facing. We wanted to understand how daily disruptions to work schedules, such as Jeanette Navarro getting sent home when things were slow at her Starbucks, affect workers and their families. And we wanted to understand whether these new laws, these schedule stability laws, aimed at regulating unstable scheduling practices would reduce unpredictability in schedules and therefore improve worker and family well-being, or whether they might have unintended consequences, such as lowering work hours. We realized that in order to do this, there are many data sets out there that have pieces of this, that ask folks general questions about their work schedules, general questions about benefits that they might be receiving or assistance that they might be receiving from the government. But in order to really understand the daily lived experiences of low-wage service workers with young children, we were going to need to collect our own data. That we were going to need to get data from a group of parents who could tell us about their experiences daily, because this is the time scale at which both the causes and consequences of instability occur. So when Jeanette Navarro gets sent home early, that matters that day. What is she going to do when she's just lost 2 or 3 hours of earnings? Or if she has to stay late, who's going to pick up Gavin from childcare? We decided to do this work in Philadelphia, which was one of the settings for this new kind of regulation. Philadelphia is an important setting for this work because in many ways it's kind of a typical big US city. It's one of the top 10 cities in terms of the size of this population. It's diverse and multiracial, but has a pretty typical set of labor policies and regulations. So for example, the city of Philadelphia still has the federal minimum wage. There are other sites, for example in California and Seattle, that had also passed schedule stability laws. Those cities were much more progressive already on a host of labor issues. The city of Philadelphia passed what they call the Fair Workweek Standard in late 2018, which was originally scheduled to go into effect on January 1st of 2020. So if you want to do a study of low-wage service workers with young children, how do you find them? The answer is you find them where they work, or in our case, the answer was you find them where they work. This map, all of the shaded areas are part of the city of Philadelphia, and every single black dot, little tiny black dot, is a retail, food service, or hotel business in the city of Philadelphia. And we had staff walking the city. We subdivided the city into smaller areas with walking routes. This is one here, every blue flag is a retail, food service, or hotel business, and each day we assigned a walking route to a team of 2 recruiters, at least one of whom spoke Spanish, with a start business and a walking direction. So for example, if you zoom in now, the blue flag circled in red is a Dunkin' Donuts. So for example, on a particular day, we might have assigned staff to start at this Dunkin' Donuts, circled here in red, and walk this route counterclockwise. And at each business, they went in and introduced themselves and what they were doing there, and talked to all available workers to see if they might have a young child between the age of 2 and 7, and would they be interested in participating in a research study. And we repeated this process every day between mid-August and the end of October 2019. We had teams going out at all hours, not in the middle of the night, not in the dead middle of the night, but up until 10, 11 o'clock p.m., and on all 7 days of the week until they had covered the entire city of Philadelphia. There were some parts where they would say, is this really in the city limits? I'd say, yeah, it is. So that every single food service, retail, or hotel was visited at least once by our team. And what this means is that our project staff talked to over 12,000 service workers during that 3-month period. Of those, they identified that about 15% had a child between the ages of 2 and 7. And of those, they recruited nearly 70% of them into the study, in part by building trust face-to-face in the moment by saying, we know that your time is valuable. If you are interested in participating in the study, we will compensate you for your time. And as soon as people signed up, we handed them their very first gift card in their hand, face-to-face, that they could have. And we said, when you participate in this study, we will add value to this gift card as soon as you answer our surveys. So building trust with those target gift cards. So for those of you who are wondering, we think this process leads us to have a plausibly representative sample of service workers in those industries with young children, with 2 caveats. One, that these are primarily workers in public-facing roles, so folks who are in back of house were much more difficult to get to, and I'm happy to talk to you about that over snacks or a beer after the talk. And importantly, of those who speak English or Spanish. So in the context of Philadelphia, who we're missing here are folks who don't speak English and speak as their primary language either Chinese or Vietnamese. And what do these folks look like? These are the characteristics of our sample. I'll point you to a few things. So consistent with being hourly service workers in a major US city, these are primarily workers of color. So the majority of folks in our sample identify as either black, almost half the sample is African American or black, or Hispanic. These are largely women, not because men don't have young children, but because when recruiters go into your place of employment and say, who here is a parent of a young child, women, we think, are more likely to take on that part of their identity and talk to a stranger about it, and also because women do largely hold these roles. Folks, on average, do not have a lot of education beyond high school. And finally, this is a group for whom, remember, this is before the pandemic in 2019, there was a lot of economic hardship. So when we ask people about their monthly household income, on average, folks are telling us they have about $2,200 a month, so that's about $25,000 a year. And in order to capture daily lived experiences, we use text messages. So we harness technology. Everyone in the United States, almost, has some kind of mobile phone at this point, nothing fancy. This is my iPhone, but in order to participate in our study, you didn't need to have a smartphone or anything fancy. This simple text messaging allowed us to gather daily surveys from these folks that asked about their work and home experiences every day for a particular period of time. We did this for 4 weeks, so 30 days in a row of surveys in the fall of 2019, 2 weeks in the winter of 2020, and then another 4 weeks in the fall of 2020. And we were able to ask really detailed questions on a daily basis, like, did you work at Starbucks today? If yes, what were your hours? Were those the hours that were originally on the schedule? If no, did you have hours originally on the schedule? So we were able to get very granular information about when people worked and whether that reflected a change in their schedule. And we were also able to use this information to get detailed daily reports about family well-being. So this is the data we use. And first I'll talk about how were these families faring prior to the pandemic. I think given all this lead up, you probably won't be surprised when I tell you that schedule instability was incredibly common before the pandemic. The parents in our sample had their work schedule changed in some way on 10% of days. So you might be thinking 10% doesn't sound so bad. But what that really means is, for example, in a 30-day month, that's 3 days out of the month where folks were either having their hours changed, a shift added on that they didn't expect, or a shift canceled. And this accumulates over time, right? The schedule instability that these parents faced was driven by all these types of changes. So changes in work hours, like getting sent home early or being required to stay late, canceled shifts, where a shift was on the schedule and then at the last minute an employer says, actually, we don't need you. And what we call a surprise shift, which is when there wasn't a shift originally on the schedule, and yet an employer adds it on at the very last minute. Says, oh, actually, we're going to need you tomorrow. If you're looking at these percentages and thinking, well, these add up to more than 100%, that's because people could experience more than one type of change in a given day. And not surprisingly, parents felt much worse on days with an unexpected work schedule change. When you imagine Jeanette's experience trying to navigate her job and caring for her son, it is not surprising that on days with schedule changes, parents have much worse mood. They feel much worse. Days with schedule changes have 8 percentage point higher negative mood than days without. This is for the same parent, right? So we can get these daily reports, and so we can essentially say, for the same parent, how does that person feel on days when the schedule goes exactly as they anticipated, compared to days when there was a change to their work schedule that they didn't anticipate? Canceled shifts and surprise shifts are particularly harmful for daily well-being. Here is a graph of how things looked for work and family well-being in 2020. So as you move along this graph from your left to right, the orange line is just whether the parent worked that day. Kind of goes up and down like waves because even in the service sector, folks are less likely to work on weekends than on weekdays. That's what causes that kind of wave-like pattern. The blue line is family well-being, and that looks pretty flat. And we've gotten in this graph up till March 12th. I don't know if you all remember where you were on March 13th, but that is when Philadelphia announced the closure of non-essential businesses, the closure of schools, and a stay-at-home order. That was the date that those things were announced in cities across the country. And because we were in the field collecting this detailed daily data, we were able to see essentially in real time how quickly service workers lost access to work. So you see that orange line just goes way down, and how difficult it was for parents to manage. So family well-being also went way down. I don't know if you all remember how you were feeling in the second half of March 2020, but it was very difficult for many of us, and particularly difficult for folks in these hourly contingent positions. So we actually shifted our entire research project in response to the pandemic. We were able to launch our first survey about COVID on March 23rd, which is actually mind-blowing. For those of you who have gone through an ethics review at your university, to get that done in 10 days is pretty stunning, but we argued it was important for it to be considered quickly so that we could get into the field as soon as possible and learn how these families were faring. And then we have continued to collect data over time with our most recent data collection in the spring of 2022. The questions that we asked evolved over time as the context changed. This was new territory for researchers, it was new territory for service workers, it was new territory for all of us, and so we made these surveys very responsive to the context in order to really learn how people were doing. And we were able to do this because we already had built trust with these families, because we already had this technology in place of harnessing mobile phones to gather survey data. So all of our surveys throughout COVID were gathered using this text messaging technology. So what happened to these families during the pandemic? Well, many parents lost work. It was most acute during the first year, but remember, this is a sample that was 100% employed at the beginning, because that was the whole idea, was how do people who are working juggle all these things? And early on in the summer of 2020, only about half of our sample was working. The other half was either unemployed or out of the labor force. The orange part of that bar is the percent who are working, so that has crept up over time. That's the good news. But even by the spring of 2022, 11% of our sample was still unemployed, and 7% had left the labor force. And in particular, it's important to note that even among a group who was all working in the same city, in the same industries, in the same kind of hourly positions, did not equally experience the layoffs that came from the COVID pandemic. So across the first 2 years of the pandemic, Just under 27% of Black parents in our sample were laid off, 25% of Hispanic parents were laid off, but only just about 20% of the white parents were laid off. So this lack of access to work, even though people were in very similarly situated before the pandemic, was not felt equally. And this is a theme throughout these results, is that in many ways the pandemic exacerbated pre-existing racial inequality that we're going to need to think hard about. Though many lost income during the pandemic, those who were not working lost more. It is always the case that in terms of income, working is better than not working. And that was even true during a time when the government was providing a lot of additional income supports to people because of the pandemic. So in these two figures, here's what I want you to take away, okay? On the left are the folks who are employed, on the right are the folks who are not employed. Pink or red means that they report income loss relative to how they were doing before the pandemic. And green means things were either the same or maybe even a little bit better. So things, and then for both groups, how are things kind of doing over time? The biggest takeaway here is that the pink and red is always taller for those who weren't working. For those who experienced layoffs or left the labor force, they always had lower income, household income. Even when we said, think about all the supports that you receive from the government, from people who are still working in your household, the folks who had lost employment had, in many cases, substantial losses of income. So losing access to work was harmful for income, but it was also harmful for mental health. So compared to those who were working, those who were not working also had worse mental health. Here, the yellow bars are those who are not working. Across the pandemic, the orange bars are those who are working. And what this reflects is an increase in probable major depression of 4.7 percentage points. So the folks who are not working were much more likely to have serious depression and similarly sized risk of generalized anxiety. I want to note, however, that the loss of work and income were not the only contributors to worsened mental health. So those of you who are parents of school-age children or young children might remember what things were like in the fall of 2020. So in the fall of 2020, when we were doing our daily surveys, we added questions about disruptions not only to work schedules, but also to school and care arrangements. And again, we're moving through time throughout the fall, and this line is showing the percent of people who answered our surveys that day who said that there was some kind of disruption to their care or schooling for their children. So that percent got a little bit better throughout the fall, but kind of stabilized around 20 to 25% of people saying on any given day, yeah, school or care did not go how we planned. This was true whether children were in in-person school. So at this time, the school district of Philadelphia was completely remote, but some child care centers were open for in-person. No matter how families were fulfilling their school and care needs, they were experiencing disruptions throughout that fall, a highly disruptive period of the pandemic. And family well-being was worse on days with disruptions to school or care. This is true for both parents and children. So again, for the same families, we're able to look and say, how did everyone do on the day when, Gavin was able to log in to his remote school and the software for uploading worksheets was working the way it was supposed to. How did things go on the day when school or care went as expected? Compared to, for the same family, how was everyone feeling on days when school or care was disrupted? People feel much worse. Their children are doing much worse on those days with a disruption to school or care than on days without. So did the pandemic policy changes make a difference? As the pandemic unfolded, policymakers made safety net programs more generous. We broadened eligibility for unemployment insurance and made unemployment insurance more generous. At different points, there were weekly supplements of $300 or $600. That's over and above the benefit that people would be eligible for because of their earnings. The child tax credit was increased in size, so it was made more generous. The so-called phase-in was eliminated, which meant it increased access to this benefit to those with no or low earnings who otherwise would not have been able to receive it. And importantly, and this was a really innovative policy change, that child tax credit was paid monthly between July and December of 2021, rather than as a lump sum at tax time. I'm going to focus on these two, but I will note that there were a variety of ways in which we also increased nutrition assistance, recognizing the importance of families having food during this crisis, and also the government provided one-time stimulus payments to most Americans at different points during the pandemic. So what we found in our data is that the pandemic unemployment insurance reduced income loss, material hardship, and mental health problems. So receiving UI was associated with smaller losses of income, with reduced depression and anxiety. And receiving the pandemic UI supplement, in particular, was associated with also reductions in material hardship. So in particular, people saying, I'm not able to pay my rent, or I'm not able to access food. And all racial and ethnic groups in our sample benefited equally from receiving UI. So when folks were able to get UI and this expanded, more generous benefit, everyone benefited in terms of these reductions in income, material hardship, and mental health problems. However, we found tremendous disparities in who was able to access unemployment insurance. And this is in particular during a time when we were trying to make UI easier to get. So here in the blue is kind of the funnel of experiences for the Black parents in our sample. The green is the Hispanic parents in our sample. Oh, it's mislabeled. So the green is Hispanic and the orange is the white parents. And the main takeaway here is that the white folks were much more likely to actually get their UI benefits in a timely manner. So it is not that the Black and Hispanic folks never got the benefits to which they were eligible, but at the time that we surveyed people, we asked them, have you applied? For those who got through the application, were you approved? For those who were approved, have you gotten your UI? And our white participants were much more likely to have gotten UI than the participants of color. And we are not the only ones who have found this. There are others during the pandemic who have found similar patterns. But this is particularly notable because, again, these folks were in the same city, in the same kinds of jobs, and yet still this generous policy, which we know provides crucial supports to families, was not equally accessible. Why not? Well, the applications were themselves designed to create hurdles from a pre-pandemic time. The notion was if we make it hard for folks to get this benefit, then only people who really need it will access it. What it ends up doing, however, when you put up hurdles is make it harder for people who are least equipped to navigate the system or have the most complex life circumstances. These systems are often antiquated and can't be updated to eliminate these hurdles or otherwise enact more reasonable new policies. And offices are often chronically understaffed. So we really do need more research to understand where these disconnects occur and how best to address them. What about the child tax credit? So in 2021, about 3/4 of our sample told us that they had received that monthly child tax credit, but similar to UI, there were substantial disparities by race and ethnicity. So that again, the white respondents in our sample were much more likely to report that they had received that monthly cash assistance than the workers of color in our sample. But similar to UI, the benefits of this child tax credit, for material hardship in particular, were experienced by all groups. So everyone benefited, and yet this generous income support was more difficult to get for the workers of color. What did this look like? This is food insecurity. So here we asked folks if they had run out of food in the last month. So the blue bars are before the monthly child tax credit went into effect. Then the set of yellow and orange is, the first set of yellow and orange is when that benefit was paid out monthly. So the orange bar is the folks who got the CTC. and the yellow bars, the folks who didn't. The folks who got the CTC were much less likely to report that they had run out of food that month than the folks who didn't. The next set of orange and yellow bars is when the remainder of that benefit was paid as a lump sum during tax time in the spring of 2022. And we see a similar pattern for when we ask folks, not did you actually run out of food, but were you worried that you would run out of food? Additionally, we found that the lump sum payment that came at tax time in 2022 reduced parent depression. So for every $1,000 in this tax credit that parents reported receiving, depression decreased by 3 percentage points, which is about an 8% reduction in the likelihood of major depression. So to summarize, the work context and policy regime prior to the pandemic were unpredictable and unstable for many service workers with young children. The pandemic made work even more unstable, leading to income loss and mental health problems, and instability in care and school also played a role. The pandemic facilitated more generous policies and allowed us to try some new things, which were effective at reducing material hardship and mental health problems. But structural challenges that predated the pandemic made access to pandemic-era supports uneven. And white parents in our sample had more access than parents of color. So we have some challenges ahead. Generous income supports, especially those that are available to families who are not working, can help promote family well-being. But these policies were temporary, and making their expansion permanent will require political will. I think there's a moral appeal here that we should help children, especially those in economically precarious circumstances. It's not the children's fault that the structure of our economy leads these jobs to be unstable. But there's also a practical appeal. By helping children now, we are investing in the adults of tomorrow. Policies that are implemented without an explicit focus on reducing structural inequalities are likely to perpetuate disparities in access and receipt, and we can see that clearly in our data and in other research that's been going on about the pandemic-era policies in particular, which prevent parents of color from fully benefiting and potentially themselves end up perpetuating additional inequality. So additional attention must be paid to addressing structural inequalities and structural racism within policy implementation. And none of this could have been done without a huge team behind me, both funders of this work and a tremendous number of staff who made this work possible. So that will conclude my formal remarks, and I would love to take questions.
Maybe I'm a bit cynical, but I'm picturing your recruiters trying to get into a hotel or a Starbucks or a Dunkin' Donuts, and I'm wondering if there's any systematic differences between the types of businesses where, sure, you're welcome to talk to my people, or the manager tells you to get out or I'm calling the police.
Yeah, great question. So just to briefly summarize, right, how did these recruiters do this, and were there differences across different types of workplaces in how welcome or not welcome they were? So hotels were the trickiest, period. And that is because a lot of the hourly workers are not in the public-facing parts of the hotels. And of course, we could not, for a variety of reasons, send our staff up onto the guest floors. In fact, we found out on one day that a team had tried to sneak up onto the guest floors, and we said, absolutely not. Right, okay, so the hotels were the hardest. But oftentimes folks would know, someone working the front desk might actually know one of the housekeepers and would be willing to make an introduction. And the on-the-ground recruiters were really good at talking about the project and making people feel comfortable. So that's point number one. Point number two, the rule was if a manager asks you to leave, you always leave. Right, there's no... but in a lot of places, these are busy workplaces. Managers have a lot going on. So do the workers, who weren't always able to talk to us. You know, sometimes they said, it's lunch, there's a line, I can't, we got to get these orders in. But we were persistent, and we went at all different times of day, and it was random. So it wasn't like, oh, we only are going to go to the hotels on weekends, or we're only going to go to the restaurants or fast food places between 2 and 3 when we know things will be slow. We really wanted to try to be at these places at all different times of day, and to do our best to talk to as many folks as we can. And I think the workers were, in many ways, I think these are folks who do not have a lot of power vis-a-vis their employers. They don't feel like they have a lot of political power. And to have people representing Duke University coming to them and saying, we want to know about your life. We want to understand how you're doing this. We want to hear about how, what your experiences are balancing work and family. I think folks really felt heard, and doing that in person. So there are a lot of researchers interested in service workers, and they use a variety of strategies, like sending Facebook ads to workers, seeing who clicks through to sign up. We took a very different approach, a much more person-intensive, time-intensive approach, but one that really made people feel heard and built trust right from that initial interaction.
So, when you show the map of the dots, how often do the researchers go back to the same location? And when you talk about blanketing the whole city, once they signed up, were you done and you just communicated via text, or did they go back and have a personal connection?
Great question. Yeah, so 2 questions. One was, in terms of all the dots on the map of Philadelphia, how often did people from our team get to each of those dots? And then second question, did we continue to have this personal contact, or once they had signed up, did we kind of shift to a virtual way of interacting with folks? So taking the first question first, we went to every business at least once. We circled back to the largest employers multiple times because that's where the most workers are. So, for example, you might go to a local pizza joint that has 10, 15 employees. You probably only need to go to that place one time, and if you can talk to people, you can get a pretty good sense of who's there at that moment, who has a young child, and try to enroll them if they do. If you go into a Walmart, there's so many folks who are working at a Walmart that for the large employers, we did end up going back. We were keeping track of how many people had enrolled in the study in small businesses versus large businesses, and that was important for the original purpose of the study because only those large firms, the chains, were about to be regulated by this Philadelphia Fair Workweek standard, so we wanted to make sure we had balance, and so we ended up circling back to the large businesses more. In terms of how we kept in touch with folks, the face-to-face contact only happened at that initial interaction. So we talked to them about the study, we told them everything about it, what we would be asking them to do, what they would get in return, what the risks were. There really weren't risks, but it's really important ethically to make sure that you're explaining everything about this study so people can be free to decide for themselves whether they want to participate. So we had that face-to-face interaction initially, but then the interactions with folks shifted to remote Durham, North Carolina-based interactions. So we did text people, but we also called them, followed up via phone if people needed help, and kept in touch using kind of a variety of modes of technology over the course of the 3 years. Yeah.
How long was that first interaction to the person?
Yeah, how long was that first initial interaction? We worked hard on making it comprehensive but brief because people were, of course, on the clock, and so we couldn't spend, a really long time. It took between 5 and 10 minutes to do well. Yeah?
Hi, can you ask about healthcare impacts? So illness, caregiving, medical costs, funeral costs.
Yes, great question. The question is, did we ask about healthcare impacts? At different points, we did. I didn't show that here, but yes, we did ask about a variety of impacts on actual health early on in the in the spring and summer of 2020, as you can imagine, things were very stressful when someone in that household had been sick. In many ways, that accumulated with other stressors that folks were facing. So increased caregiving demands, illness, interacted, and that was particularly hard for parents and children. But we've asked about healthcare and health throughout. Yeah.
How did you determine levels of depression?
How did we determine levels of depression? We used a pretty standard 2-question screener. It's the kind of screener you might be asked those 2 questions in your primary care physician's office that have been validated. They're validated so that they're not a clinical diagnosis, but they do a pretty good job of kind of pulling apart people who probably will get a clinical diagnosis when they go through a more involved assessment, and people who probably won't. So we had 2 questions that are just asking about the extent of your depressive symptoms in the last 30 days. Yeah?
I'm not sure this is part of your study, but given the racial inequities, are there studies or does your school have suggestions for government on what it needs to do so that people from diverse backgrounds can equally access the programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what ideas do we have about how to reduce these racial inequalities? There are the complex, really hard to tackle problems, and then there are some that are maybe a little bit easier. So for example, on the perhaps slightly easier side, I mentioned that this technology is very antiquated, especially for the UI system. And even when states have been able to modernize and, for example, have online applications instead of paper applications, they don't always have online applications that are mobile friendly, so that when you pull it up on your phone, it actually looks normal, like you can actually see what's going on and you don't have to zoom in. And it turns out that, so remember how I said almost everyone in the US has a mobile phone, right? So mobile access is actually, the gaps between groups and mobile access have actually closed largely, but high-speed home internet, there are still big gaps. So if you have an online application that's really hard to do on a phone, that you really need like a desktop or laptop computer where you can log into your high-speed internet to get through, that is actually inequality driving, because you've gotten your application online, but not all households are set up to equally access that application. So really taking seriously the fact that a lot of folks, especially low-income folks, are accessing the internet on their phone, and that the way that people interface with these applications and government services needs to be mobile friendly. That's probably one of the easier ones, but not unimportant in terms of being able to get through applications, for example. Yes?
We need to ask about or consider inquire about the impact of being tangled in the criminal justice system on these members. Folks who are either victims of or charged with crimes.
Great question. So the question was, have we been able to understand people's experiences with the criminal justice system? We did not ask explicitly about that, just because it wasn't the focus of the study, but I will say that in every survey that we did throughout the pandemic, because we don't always know, we were really trying to think about what people's lived experiences were, but we did not always know. We always had a question at the end that said, what else do you want us to know about what's going on with you right now? And a lot of folks did talk about how these experiences were interfacing with interactions with the police, with the criminal justice system, and a lot of folks talked about the George Floyd protests. So that was also happening at the same time as our initial waves of data collection, and how those stressors of this kind of beginnings of maybe a racial reckoning and reflecting on the criminal justice system were intersecting with all the other challenges of the pandemic that they were facing. So that was a pretty common theme in that kind of open-ended question that we asked.
Were you able to assess those who were documented versus undocumented, those who had valid authorization to work versus not, and the impact of being able to receive stimulus and credits for those who were undocumented?
Great question. So the question was about do we know who was documented or undocumented, and kind of the implications of that for being eligible for these government programs. So we did not ask people about their documentation status because for a couple of reasons. One, because this trust building was so important, we did not think walking around with our Duke University, kind of institutional imprimatur and asking and making any noises like we wanted to know people's documentation status was not going to work in terms of building trust. And also, frankly, we didn't want to know the answer, not because it's not crucially important, to be clear, for people's lived experience, but because we didn't want to be in a situation where we were going to have to tell someone about it. So but primarily because of the trust building, we did not ask. So what we did ask if that parent was born in the U.S. or not, which of course is not the same. But we do think, regardless of documentation status, for folks who are not born in the U.S., which is a large share of our Hispanic respondents, fears about receiving government assistance are very real and do have a chilling effect. And we think that's largely what's driving, especially the UI, the lower rates of even applying for UI, is people being really worried that applying for benefits will affect their ability to have a path towards citizenship, for example.
I can't recall when we showed the data about the disparity in terms of people accessing public benefits.
Yeah.
Is that national data, or is that data special to your project?
So all the data that I present, so good question. The question was, the data that I showed about disparities in accessing UI, was that national or was that specific to our project? All the data I showed today was specific to my project. But I will say that the disparities that we see are not anomalous to hourly service workers with young children in the city of Philadelphia. These patterns are seen across the country in terms of these disparities in access to UI. And in fact, a lot of times when we see these national disparities, then you might wonder, well, is it because we know there's structural racism and so there's differential eligibility, and that's what's actually driving differences in receipt, or is there something about the legacy of slavery and attitudes towards black workers in the South? Is there some regional thing where it's harder to get UI in the South than in other parts of the country, and that's actually what's driving disparities? Those two stories that I just told are correct. That's true. But here, what's really striking is none of that applies. So all of these folks were in the same city, in the same state policy context, which Pennsylvania is actually known to be pretty good on helping people get UI. They're not a state that's put up the kind of barriers that, for example, North Carolina has put up. So here are these folks who are all in the same city and state, who are working in the same kinds of jobs, so it can't be because of differences in the types of job they have, who have the same, on average, length of time in those jobs, so it's not because the white workers were working there longer than the workers of color, for example, right? So they have all these similarities that are generally the reasons why people say, well, we know we have these national disparities because of these other reasons. None of those apply here, and yet we still see these disparities. So that tells us that there's actually something deeper going on that we need to really think hard about. All right, we have time for one more question. Yeah?
I was going to ask, do you have plans to go back to your original research to add more study hours and what that does to our
Great.
Did you learn anything about that even though you pivoted into COVID?
Yeah, so great question. The question was, do we have plans to go back to our original research, focus on these unpredictable work hours and the policy changes that might reduce them? So the short answer to that question is yes and no. So the city of Philadelphia, when the pandemic started, they indefinitely delayed the implementation of that new Fair Workweek standard. They have subsequently started to implement it, but they were implementing in the middle of a pandemic, so it's a really complicated time to be trying to enforce these labor regulations. We did, however, because of our original interest, ask folks about it as we've continued to survey them. And the short answer of what I can say about what we're learning is two things. So one, unsurprisingly, new labor regulations that you roll out in the middle of a global pandemic don't work very well. So we don't see much of an impact yet of that Philadelphia Fair Workweek standard. But also, and not unrelated, is that there's still very little awareness among the workers about this law, also because of the pandemic. So the organizers and activists who had been pushing the city to pass this law were gearing up before the pandemic for a major education campaign to reach workers, to make sure they understood the rules, knew how to file complaints, were supported in doing so, could work collectively to try to make sure that the city was enforcing the regulations. Of course, that was all made much more complicated by the pandemic, and so awareness is still really low among workers, and there's still a lot of work for the city to do, and for the labor organizers to do to really see that law through.
What a special treat.